Hi, everyone. Today I'm going to take you through the process I went through to upgrade the X-Arcade Tankstick into a Tron control board primarily by adding a Tron stick spinner, some lighted buttons, and replacing the trackball with a lighted trackball. This is more of a guide than step-by-step, instructions. I didn't want to have you watch through, me unscrewing 15 screws and then screwing the back in and that type of stuff. So this is more to get you pointed in the right direction. I wanted to try to keep it as short as possible, otherwise it'd be a 10-hour video. So by way of explanation, what we're doing is um, a couple of different things all at once. We're doing about 7 things at the same time. Some of them are pretty easy and some of them are not so easy. Um, Starting off, we're swapping out some of the black buttons for colored buttons. We are replacing some of the existing buttons with lighted buttons, eventually adding more buttons to the device as well. We're swapping out the trackball, which is solid white, with a translucent one to allow us to add color. Adding a spinner for Tron. We're moving some buttons around, which is a little bit interesting, not hard, but interesting. Adding the Tron stick, of course, and then splicing a bunch of buttons together so it behaves the way that I want it to behave. At the end of this presentation, there are a list of parts that I used. And as always, I remind you that, this is at your own risk. I'm not an expert. This is just me kind of brute forcing my way through the process. So on the difficulty meter here, I rate this as kind of medium high. There's a lot of tiny parts. There's a lot of hard to get to parts and areas. You need to be comfortable doing some measuring and drilling and splicing and all that type of stuff. And again, we're kind of improvising with how we use these parts. They're not really designed to be used the way that I'm using them in many cases. So overall, if you are patient and take your time and careful, it's probably about a 12-hour task. So it took me roughly 6 weeks working at, a couple hours on the weekend and half an hour here and there and testing in between each step. So why am I doing this? Here's some context. Back in 21, I bought an original cabinet from the Rec Room Masters with their Extension Plus controllers. And you can notice that the spinner is way over on the left-hand side of the device, right? So it's really hard to um, use that. If I'm trying to do Tempest, for example, and using these 3 buttons, I'm almost standing completely to the left of the cabinet, which is uncomfortable. If I tried to do Tron without a Tron stick, it's almost impossible. I got to have one hand moving, one hand firing. It's kind of a nightmare. So I was going to upgrade this, but when I first got it during the pandemic, there were not Tron sticks available. There's just the supply chain had dried up. So about a year later, there was a 50% off Black Friday sale, and I picked up the Tron Arcade 1 cabinet. I thought, oh, this will be cool, and scratched that itch. And it's a nice cabinet. It's cool looking. Um, I just don't like the kind of scrunched in feeling and the tiny screen. It felt overall a little more toy-like to me than a substantial cabinet like on the left. So I was cruising around looking at different stuff and still thinking about the Tron stick earlier this year or last year. And I noticed that these old one-up arcade systems, if you could find one new in box, was going for around $3,000 because they were discontinued. And used ones were, up to $2,000 in some cases. So I said, all right, that's the sign I needed. So I sold um, the one-up cabinet for about 3 times what I paid for it, and I used that money to roll over into a new Rec Room Master cabinet. So that's kind of the context of how I came to where I'm at. All right, this is an eyesore, but overall, what I wanted to do was to not break the functionality of the X-Arcade Tank Stick. What I mean by that is I didn't want to eliminate too many buttons. I wanted to keep the core functionality of the main action buttons and the joysticks here for single player mode especially. Um, but in my build, I'm using the back end from Arcade 1, which is fantastic back end, by the way. Um, all the control buttons are here, right? And you had to put them somewhere, and that's where they were mapped to. That's okay. But I didn't like bumping into them by mistake. So I'll be in the middle of gameplay, and then my wrist would rest on something and it'd pause the screen or exit or go back in menu or whatever. So what I wanted to do was to move all of those to new buttons across the top row here and repurpose those for things like fire and shields or bomb or whatever it is that was going on. So conceptually what I did, and actually what I did, is I spliced these two buttons together so that they are the same. So these buttons still work where they need to on the fighting games and other games where it makes sense to use these 6 buttons. But for single arcade main type games, um, I was able to use these as well additionally, right? So if I'm using the spinner and these like in Tempest, my hands are right where they need to be. If I'm using the Tron stick and the spinner, my hands are right where they need to be. So this is just explaining a map kind of using the original mapping for Arcade 1 and how I modified that and remapped those onto this um, in the X-Arcade Tankstick. Overall, I'm really happy with the results. This is the before, this is the after. I think it looks pretty nice. I've got the illuminated trackball now. I've kind of made it clear that these buttons are special by changing their color. And then across the top, I've got all the control buttons out of the way across the top. And now when I'm playing games, I can be centered. I can use this as my main um, joystick for games that I want in MAME. So I have Pac-Man mapped to that. I have Galga mapped to that. I've got all sorts of things. Um, but overall, really like it. It's working well. So here's what I had to do to get to that spot. And again, this is more of a guide than step-by-step instructions, right? And I didn't want to make you have to watch me unscrew all 8 screws and things like that. So um, pop off these little inserts, little plastic inserts in the circles in the middle here. Take out all the screws. Generally, the rubber feet stay glued to the back of the case. Pry off the case, and then that exposes the back of the unit. I had a hard time finding much detailed instructions or pictures, what the inside of this even looked like for me to judge if I had room for buttons and things like that. But you can clearly see there's lots of room here on the, what is in effect the right side of the case to put more buttons. There's not as much room on the left side of the case as I thought, so I had to change my initial design to move some of these things over. And the one thing I didn't notice is this bundle of wires. I'll mention this a few times, but these are pre-spliced extra grounding wires. So if you add buttons and move buttons, you can just use these wires. I didn't realize that till I was done. I thought they were just extra mouse wires left over from the trackball, but that wasn't the case. So we've got our cover off. The first thing we're going to do is replace the black buttons with some colored buttons. So these are the black buttons. And it's pretty easy. There's a long arm on this switch. And you can use one of the thin screwdrivers to kind of pry off that long arm, and then it just rocks back. And then you can just take that whole switch off. Use the button wrench. This is on the list of parts. Makes it really easy to um, take off and add buttons. You can see that arm that I was talking about here. So if you just peel back that arm a little bit, then you can take that switch and just rock it right out. So rock the switches off, kind of set them aside, pull the old buttons off, put the new buttons in. And there's nothing wrong with the buttons that are included or the switches that are included with that. So if you, unless you're a diehard fan of a certain type of switch, um, just keep those existing switches and put them back in, right? Reversing the process. So replacing with color buttons, very easy. Next, and this was a little bit challenging, mostly due to the tight fit here, is to replace the existing player 1 and player 2 buttons with lighted buttons. And so you just remove the buttons the way you did before, pry back that arm, rock out the switch, and then you're going to remove the buttons like we did in the prior step, so I'm not really showing that here. And then for the lighting harness, what I chose to do was to take a USB cable. There's kits you can buy on Amazon that have this end already off, but you can also just take one of your USB cables and cut the end off. Connect the red wire to the red wire and the black wire to the black wire, and connect this to a new wiring harness. So I'll use this wiring harness that has enough to connect, I don't know, 20, 30 lights throughout the process. Then you install the new lighted button housing. So on the lighted buttons, the switch and the light are built into the same unit. And so there's a lot going on there. My picture's a little bit blurry, but you want to orient I'm calling it the legs here, so that you've got room to put these switches in and twist them. So these are kind of the gutters that I'm calling them, where the light socket inserts into that. And then when you install it, you take this, there's gutters here that align, right? You push that into the receptacle and you spin it. And this is where you come into the space constraints, right? There is not much room here. You want to try to make it so that the lights, the buttons and wires and everything end up off to one side, not directly up and down, or you won't have room to put them in. Even with this, I ended up having to, in my installation, kind of bend these wires and these connectors up because I just didn't have enough room to do what I needed to do here. So then you're going to take the wiring that we built in the prior step and connect the black and red to the wiring parts of that switch. So you see there's connectors here on that switch for black and red, and then the normal button switches are off to the side as they usually are. Don't worry if you get the polarity wrong. It's pretty easy to fix and test. So what I did is, after I did this, I took that USB connector from that prior step, right, and connected it just to a wall USB charger and looked to see if it lit up. If it didn't lit up, I knew I had my black and red wires wrong, so I just reversed them. Not a big deal. The other thing I did, so I did replace this button, the mechanism of the button, to be consistent with the others, right, raised with the chrome edge. But the light, I didn't connect to my new wiring harness. This button was already lit up on the original tank stick. And so I used that light and power source to light that button, because this is what tells you when the tank stick is in programming mode. So don't worry about when you plug this into the USB power strip, this won't light up. This only lights up after the controller inside has fully initiated. So anyway, you don't have to. You could just use the new wiring harness if you wanted to. I wanted to use this to indicate when the tank stick was in programming mode. Next up, we have replacing the trackball. This was actually a lot easier than I expected. I've been scared about this for years. You remove the nuts and lock washers. There's 4 of them. And then there's also screws holding the top case and the bottom case together. So these screws and bolts on the left are securing it to the case. These are keeping the cover locked in. So take all of that off. It's very easy. Um, and then don't make the mistake I did. So what I did is I just lifted off the cover, and really all the guts were in the top, which when you think about it is really the bottom, when the controller's flipped the right way. And so all the parts spilled out in a pile here. So what you want to do instead is to carefully remove that whole assembly off these bolts, lift it, flip it upside down, and then take off what is really the top cover. So you can see what that looks like over here on the right hand side. At that point, you take off the white trackball, you replace it with a translucent trackball, and put everything back together. Um, One thing I was having issues with even before I started this is that the trackball didn't spin very smoothly. I noticed that for these spindles, I could spin them manually and they would just free spin on their own forever, whereas this one would not free spin. So I don't know if that is by design for some reason to keep the ball from just going nuts and that this one is slower, or if I had something that was defective. This was even before I took it all apart. So if I manually spin this spindle, it would just go like a quarter turn and stop. So for this bearing here and all the bearings, I put a drop of 3-in-1 oil. And then when I got it all back together, I just exercised the heck out of it. And now this trackball is super smooth and precise, does exactly what I want it to do. So it makes me think that this is supposed to be slow by design and not free spinning, but it was too slow. I had a hard time moving the trackball across the screen. But anyway, so you just reattach, do the reverse of what you did here, reattach everything, flip it back up the right way, attach it to the bolts, put all the bolts back in, and you're off and running. And how do we light it? So there's probably better ways to do it than this. This is what I did. Um, I found a USB light on Amazon. This is actually they bill it as an automotive atmosphere light for inside your car. But it let me pick whatever colors I wanted. It has 2 LED bulbs. I found a different one that had 3 bulbs and it got really hot, so I went back to 2 bulbs. Um, this lets me choose my brightness. I could just let it rotate through colors if I wanted to. So it had a whole bunch of functions. I said, why not? So I took that and put some double-sided tape on it and then reinforced that with Gorilla Tape. And I figure that's sturdy enough. And if it falls off, I'll fix it later. But again, it's important you take the time to get the color that you want, the brightness that you want, the effect that you want, because once the covers are back in, it's kind of hard to get back in there and do anything about it. But came out really easy and very simple and pretty darn happy with that. All right, next up in difficulty and challenge was adding the spinner. Wasn't horrible mechanically, it wasn't bad. So I wanted the spinner to be as far away from the trackball as possible and as far away from the buttons as possible so that when I'm using these buttons here, I'm not bumping into the spinner and causing some unintended action. But I also wanted it to be in a good distance from the Tron stick and a good distance for these buttons that I'll use here for Tempest. So what I did is I flipped it over. This is the edge of the um, controller, and this is the next the trackball, and these are the next buttons over. And I wanted to get it as close to the edge as possible, but still leave enough room to work the lock ring. So from the back, I figured out about the placement I wanted. I drilled a pilot hole, and so when I drilled it from the front, I could use that pilot hole as the center position. You can also see I lessons learned after the fact, right? I covered everything with tape, and in this case, a trash bag, because this dust just goes everywhere. It gets inside the trackball, it gets inside the joysticks, it gets inside the buttons. So you need to do something like this to help that. I'm using these Forstner bit. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right. These make fantastic clean holes as opposed to a typical rough and ready hole saw. So then I inserted the spinner unit from the back, and I tightened it from the back with the button wrench. Got it good and snug, and then connected these parts. They're all very clearly labeled. They only fit in one spot. It's all good to go. Um, you end up, with this USB cord, and if you're only doing a USB connection, that's pretty much all you need. Take that, hook it up to the USB, and you're good. This particular spinner had a push-pull capability, and I'm sure I connected that wrong. I'll have to figure out what to do with that later. So there's a note on that says if you're going to use this for push-pull, you need to connect it to a controller. And I'm like, well, I don't have a spare controller, and I didn't want to add yet another USB controller to this mix, so I spliced it to the pinball buttons that are on the tank stick. Um, and it's okay, but if I bump it while I'm doing something else, for some reason it changes focus. It acts as a mouse click. And there's software inside the GRS controller that says enable or disable. I said disable, but it's still acting as a mouse click. So I'll have to go back and figure that out later. It really is mostly just used for discs of Tron and a couple other games. And I've never even played Discs of Tron, so I might go back and just disconnect it if it continues to be problematic. All right, now we start to get into very messy stuff. I'm moving buttons now, right? And I want to have all my control buttons like add a coin across the top. So these are where the player 1, player 2 buttons used to be. And I wanted to have my coin buttons next to those and centered with those. The problem I had is the holes are different sizes. So these holes are a little bit larger than the holes that I needed for the new lighted buttons. I just kind of eyeball it. This is not something I'm good at, so I tried to put a piece of tape to figure out where the center line was. You can see it's not exactly perfect. I'm off a little bit here. There's more visible here than is here, so my button is angled slightly. And then I just drilled a pilot hole where I thought these buttons should go. And you can see extremely messy. I should have had all this covered, all this dust and everything went right into the trackball mechanism. Fortunately, I hadn't replaced it yet, and that was the one I was taking out. The main thing I was worried about was getting too close to this bracket, because I couldn't go really any closer to it and still leave room for the lock ring. I'm still a little bit too close, so a couple millimeters to the right or to the left might have been better, but that was about as good as I could get from eyeballing it. On hindsight, I maybe should have gone back to the method I used with the spinner. So with the spinner, I put the ring in the back and drilled a pilot hole to tell me where to drill from the front. So I probably would have been better off doing something like that to get a more precise placement, but c'est la vie. Again, from a next step perspective, at that point, you install the buttons, right? So you put the buttons in, you lock them down, you attach the wires, you attach the power sources. So this is where you get into customizing in terms of deciding what buttons you want, where you want them. Again, be careful. The select button was a little too close to a mounting bracket, so I had to, I couldn't get the lock ring to attach firmly. I had to put some felt pads and stuff on the underside to kind of act as a washer so that at least I could get a snug fit of the lock ring. Otherwise, it wouldn't stay fit. So this is where we start to get out of um, step-by-step instructions and into just some general guidance, right? Decide where you want the buttons to be. You've got a good amount of room here to put buttons and virtually no room on the right side to put buttons due to the other stuff that's there. We've already shown you how to install the wires, connect the wiring harness. I'll show you how to splice the wires for the actual controls in a minute, and cover everything with tape and cloth and newspaper, whatever you got handy to keep it from going inside the other units. I also used painter's tape to kind of snag the wires on the backside and just get them away from where I was drilling holes. And keep an eye out where the parts are underneath, right? So just don't go crazy and start drilling from the top without knowing what's happening underneath. If you want flush mount, I think the 1 1/8 bit hole drill would be best. But these will all have kind of raised ledges on them, so I wanted a uniform look across the top, so I left those with smaller holes. Okay, moving on to the main attraction, the Tron joystick. This was actually a lot easier than I expected. I just was methodical about it. The first thing you want to do is take a picture so you know what color wires go to what switch. I'll show you where that comes into play in the next step. Remove the nuts that are holding the existing controller in place. Disconnect the wires from that controller, and then knock out these long screws. You don't need them. We're going to use the screws that were provided by the GRS. So there's some shorter black bolts that you're going to push through into this universal adapter plate, and then you're going to tighten those in place. Be careful not to over tighten. You know, it's just press wood here, so you could conceivably start to dimple your press wood. You want them firm, but not crank on with all your strength. So you're going to mount this to your universal adapter plate. And then you've got some prep work to do on the Tron joystick. So first you have to cut off the zip ties that are already there. And then you're going to lift this plate off. And then you have to take out this metal ring and just reorient it by 90 degrees. So you can tell you're doing it right. I try to keep the pictures the same. So here I've got the Tankstick logo on the left, and you can see these pins are this way. And so when you're done, you want the pins to be parallel to that logo instead of perpendicular. Next, you have to decide what restrictor plate you're going to use. So this is going to determine how much freedom of movement you have. By default, it's the round restrictor plate, which gives you unlimited movement. You've got an oval one that gives you a little bit of guidance, but it doesn't prohibit you from doing an angle. So this is an 8-way. And then you've got the 4-way. So I went with the 4-way. I'm not sure that's the right choice. It's working. I might down the road switch it back up to this oval one. All right, next we need to physically mount the Tron control unit. This is the way I did it. Is this the perfect way? I don't know. I put the wiring harness connector towards the front where there was the most space for me to get in there and do wiring. One thing I'm not sure of why it was this way, but they had 2 sets of bolts, a small and a large. The small was too small to connect, and the large is too large to connect. So I went with the large, and I had this kit of washers that I use for stuff, and I just added 5 washers to every bolt, right? It worked, so that's how I did it. From underneath, then you're going to feed the wires through and push the joystick up. And then to lock the joystick in place, you push down on this ring and spin it 90 degrees so it's locked, right? So You can see this is the open position here. This is the locked position. And of course, when I flipped the deck over to look at it, I realized that I had the firing mechanism pointing in the wrong direction. So I just flipped it back over, unlocked this, pulled the mechanism out, spun it 180 degrees, put it back up, and then relocked it. But overall, it was pretty easy. The next thing we want to do is get the lights to work. So there's a control unit that you attach the light wiring to, and that control unit changes things like brightness and speed and effects if you want it to look like it's flickering or be solid or whatever. This has push buttons on it to do all of that. So I took these wires, I connect them to that wiring harness from the earlier step. I want to say step 2, I don't remember. And hooked it up to a USB wall charger and played with the buttons until I got the lights, the brightness, and the effect I wanted. And again, you can't really change this easier later without taking out the back cover again. And next is the fun and scary part. So you hook up the wiring harness that was provided by GRS to the controller and then cut off the ends for splicing. Maybe you can connect this directly to the motherboard in the tank stick. I don't know. Didn't try. I'm more of a brute force kind of guy. All right, so if you remember our picture that we took, this is why we took it, so we know what colors are used for what. You can see a purple wire here that is used for ground, so we'll connect that to the black on the joystick. And then, just logically looking at the mechanics of this, if I push the joystick forward, it actually moves the stick down, and this knob, which presses against this button, which is connected to the right wire, right? So forward is technically white. Backwards, the opposite direction, is technically gray, right? So you can kind of see how this works. When you push it left, it hits the right switch, which is connected to brown. When you push it right, it hits this left switch, which is connected to red. So that allowed me to come up with this wiring diagram. And then on the Tron stick, I had an ohm meter that I connected between the black ground and each of these colors individually to see what mimic the same results, left, right, up, down, and so on. And then I just spliced the wires based on what my findings were. So I don't know how consistent the colors are from one tank stick to the next. I don't know how consistent the wiring harness is on the Tron joystick. And if you switch, instead of using the right stick for Tron to the left stick for Tron, then your color is going to be different. So you may have to rethink this color chart. But this is what worked for me. So I have these crimping ends. I think they're called B splices, where I use my wire crimping tool and I strip them, twist them together, and then crimp them in 3 places. So 1 to try to catch the housing, and then 2 to try to catch the wires. At this point, I would suggest that you attach it to whatever gaming unit you're using and see if the left, right, up, down is working the way that you expect it to. If not, there's a ton of slack on these, so you can just cut them off. And let's say I had these orange and brown should have been connected to the red, right? Then cut it off, reconnect it, and test it again. Scary at first, but once you start doing it, you can see it's not a big deal. All right, I don't even know where to begin to describe my craziness here. This is where you want to Decide what buttons you want to join, if any, what you want to move, if any, how to extend the wiring, if any. Um, so I plotted it out in PowerPoint here just to try to get my mind right. I initially had this pause button over by exit, but then I realized that there's no room underneath, so I put the pause back over by the select button. Um, when it comes to the Tron, right, there's a trigger button and there's wires that are labeled for the trigger button. So I wanted the trigger button to be wired to the A button. If I was just looking at this in the right half, right, and I wanted the top, um, I don't know what it is, bomb button or whatever you want to call it, to be connected to B. But I also wanted to splice these extra orange and blue buttons that I put in to the same. So on this right side, I have a three-way splice between the trigger, A, and orange. On the left side, it's just a two-way splice between A and orange. I'm saying A just because that's the first button, right? If you follow this mapping, it's G and H. So I've got G mapped to trigger, mapped to orange, mapped to this upper left location. I've got H mapped to bomb, blue, second button. That's my own nonsense. So you can figure out what works well for you. Um, the other thing in this design that I didn't carry over is there is a button, this slash here that is labeled as a special pause. This allows you in the Arcade 1 build to do save states and things like that, so you can kind of do a memory snapshot of what's going on in a game. Um, I never use that. Anytime myself or a guest hits that button by mistake, it causes all sorts of problems. So I just left it disconnected. If it's something you use, you got plenty of room up here. You could put it next to here. You can put it in the back. You can put it off to the side. Whatever works for you. So in my case, I just left it loose in the case. I'm just not using it for anything. Whereas this button, which was pause, I extended and moved the wiring harness over to here. So I did keep the pause function. So again, what I was trying to do is to keep all of the same functions, just kind of move their locations and make them a little bit easier and customized for me to use. I've got a pretty big rat's nest here, but in general, it wasn't as bad. If you take it slow and move the wires one at a time, uh, it's not bad, right? So if you are moving a button function or wires and it had a brown ground wire, make sure that you take from this bundle of wires down here the brown ground wire, because that connects to a certain place on the motherboard back here. So always, if you're moving, make sure that you move like for like, right? Um, what I did is I purchased a spare button wiring harness because it had all these crimp ends already on it. And so if I was moving a button that had, for example, a yellow, then when I recrimped it, I crimped yellow to yellow. So I had I had something to map back to the original button on the controller. It's not strictly necessary. You can use any color you want. And because I only bought one spare wiring harness, I should have bought two or three. Eventually I was saying, well, okay, I'm going to crimp a yellow to an orange. That's close enough. It doesn't matter. You're just trying to get a signal from one place to another. Now you can also notice that the um, buttons coming out of the Tron stick don't differentiate ground and the solid color. Technically, it doesn't exactly matter, right? All you're doing is creating a momentary connection between the two. Um, there's probably someone with an electrical degree that would argue differently with me, and that's okay. But so for the buttons coming out of the Tron stick, I just connected them to whatever I felt like. The nice thing as well with the ones coming out of the Tron stick is that they have male ends on them, so you can just slide them into the female receiver. You don't even really have to splice. The issue will be if I go back in to change the restrictor plate, I'm going to have to undo all my zip ties, find out where they're connected, disconnect them, change the restrictor plate, and then put a new one back on. But not the end of the world. When you're splicing buttons together, I chose to put them all in parallel. If you're joining buttons, I think that's critical. Otherwise, you won't ever complete the circuit. So the ground doesn't matter exactly, but on the trigger, you do have to make sure that those are done in parallel if you're joining two buttons together. I hope that makes sense. It's experimentation. And then you can see here I labeled some of the things I wasn't using special pause. I just left that in there. So if I ever decide I want to reattach it, I've got room to reattach it and I can. And again, I forgot about, or I didn't realize that these were all ground wires that I could have just used. So I've got way more splices than I needed. I probably did about 30 splices and I probably only needed to do 15 because I didn't realize these extra ground wires were here. The next thing I did before I buttoned it up was to kind of zip tie everything to everything else. I tried to get wires away from the trackball area. I tried to get the wires, this isn't even the final version, right? I eventually zip tied these up here and these off to the side. The buttons away from anything, the wires away from anything mechanical. So anywhere there was mechanical. And then I also, because these move around, I wanted to leave enough slack so that the wires themselves were not impeding the movement of the joystick. So basically just zip things out of the way so that when you flip it over, they all don't flop into your case, right? And they don't put any extra load on anything. And you can see down here, I'd mentioned earlier, I eventually had to bend some of these crimp ends up because there wasn't enough room in here for 4 lighted buttons. So as long as you're careful, it's okay. The other tip is I left several, I think about 5 extra segments of my power harness for the LED lights. So in case I do decide to add some additional LED buttons down the road for something, those are already in there. So they're just sitting loose. They're not hurting anything. And then you can see my wonderful woodworking skills in action up here. You're going to end up with 3 USB cables that you have to get out of this case. So I tried drilling a hole that didn't look this bad at first for the grommet, but the hole was too small. I could not get the grommet in. And so I said, oh, this sucks. I'm going to have to make a hole bigger. I don't know how to make a hole bigger. I used the next size up hole, but because I had already drilled out the middle, there was nothing for it to grab into. So it was just kind of chewing things up. So I eventually just took a drill and kept enlarging the circle with the drill. When I put the grommet in, the grommet is all loose. I don't have the final picture here, but I put the grommet in and then right now it's just taped. I'll probably glue it in eventually, but for now, again, it's all hidden. You're never going to see this anyway. It doesn't matter. So I tried to put a bunch of extra zip ties on that bundle of wires so that as a strain relief. So I put zip ties here and then I zip tied this pre-existing wire to this so that hopefully that would act as kind of a strain relief and not rip all these cables out. But from a hardware perspective, that's pretty much it. Again, I'm happy with the way it looks. Eventually, but probably not, I might replace these buttons with something that look a little bit better. I didn't love these buttons. The raised look I think is okay. I can live with it, especially since I didn't want to re-drill this hole over here. I didn't really have much of a choice. But I find these buttons sometimes stick if you push them too hard. I don't know if I just got cheap buttons or what. My player 2 button, the light is a little finicky. So if the wires aren't just right, it won't light. These labels that I put in here for coin and exit and whatever are just spin loose. So as you use it, exit will be upside down or sideways and coin will be upside down or sideways, or the people will be upside down. I tried putting a drop of glue in these, but it doesn't really matter because the outside mechanism is what is spinning. But anyway, the ball is well and uniformly lit. I love the location of this. It's perfect for the spinner. Um, it makes it really easy now with the labeled buttons for people to know what to do. If I go back to my original Rec Room Masters extension controller, right? The buttons, although they're illuminated, didn't have any labels, and so the labels are actually on the deck, but you can't read them. So I had to jerry rig an extra light here so people could at least have a chance of reading them. Um, I don't know what the current Rec Room Masters deck looks like, so maybe they fix that. New owners, so nothing against that, but it's hard for new users and guests to navigate what the controls were. So that was the other part of my goal here, is to make things easier to navigate. So um, if you've got some questions, ask them, right? Don't be afraid to customize this the way you want. I made plenty of mistakes as I went along the lines and didn't hook things up correctly. I'm sure there's electrical engineers out there who go, oh, you can't do that. You don't have the right impedance and blah, 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 whatever. It works. Um, I probably won't have a lot of real answers. So if somebody says, oh, well, what's the impedance of 6 lights versus 10? I don't know. Hook it up and see what happens. Just some final notes, right? I already mentioned I didn't really, I think the lighted buttons feel a little bit cheap, but you're only going to use them once in a while in terms of manipulating the menus. The other problem I had is I had all these spare USB lights and even some additional lights connected to my PC so that when I turned on the PC, they all turned on. Eventually, about the time I added the spinner, I started having some other USB problems, right? So my Wi-Fi is over USB and that would just disappear, not connect, or reappear later. The spinner COM port number would start changing. So every time I rebooted, I would have to go in and change my settings in main because sometimes it'd be 4 and sometimes it'd be 3 and sometimes it'd be 5. Um, so there's something not working right with my motherboard with respect to USB. I may just have too many things and drawing too much power, but there should be ample ability to do that, right? There's 15 ports, USB ports on my system. I've got an 850 watt power supply. I've got a mid-range CPU, a mid-range GPU. I shouldn't be overpowering anything. But this particular motherboard that I have doesn't support Windows 10. And if I try to load the Windows 11 USB drivers, the motherboard crashes. And so right now I've got a million question marks in my device manager around USB topics. So I suspect it's just that the motherboard can't properly manage the USB connections. So what I ended up doing is taking all of the lighted things. So this is the lights for the buttons, the light for the trackball, and I also have trim around my Tron case. And I moved those to an external power source. And that's a smart outlet. So I can say, for example, Alexa, turn on my Tron lights, and Alexa will turn on all of the lights. It's not perfect, but gets the job done. And then just a final note on the Tron stick. It's a fine Tron stick. Please don't misinterpret this. It feels lightweight. It doesn't feel like a super heavy duty stick. I don't get a good click when I move it around. It's working. It's functional. I don't have any mechanical problems with it. I don't know if you get, a bunch of rowdy people banging on this, playing fight games with it, if it's going to last in that context. It might not, right? But at least now we know how to replace it. But for the price and what it does, and the embedded lighting and the embedded fire buttons and all that other stuff, um, I'm mostly happy with it. I think for the price, it's fine. Parts list. A lot of this just Googling around and finding stuff. So In my case, I got two regular fire buttons that were orange. I got blue buttons. Um, I made sure to get 5-volt LED buttons because that was always my plan, was to power those through USB. If you're going to power them some other way, then that opens up more opportunities. Um, you certainly could get a separate controller that manages voltage and lights and all this other stuff. Knock yourself out. It's not that hard. Um, I got an extra black and red wiring harness that you saw. I got two of them. I only needed one. The Tron stick, I don't remember my exact pricing, so these are all kind of ballpark, was 40 to 50 bucks. The mounting plate, I have no recollection, 10, 15 bucks. I got a full wiring harness kit that already had the pre-crimped ends on them. I probably should have got 2 or 3 of those if I wanted to keep the color consistent. The spinner, I got the push-pull spinner. Trackball, I got on Amazon. Um, this LED light I got on Amazon. The USB-A with open black, red, and wires I got on Amazon. The barrel wrench I got on Amazon. These B connectors for wire splicing I got on Amazon. Washers I got in my local hardware store. The grommets were Amazon. I still don't love how this came out, but it is what it is. A small bag of zip ties from Amazon. Tools you need, something to strip wires off, something to crimp wires. So I've got a fairly basic tool for that, a wire cutter, needle nose pliers, various screwdrivers. I use painter's tape to help for cleaner holes when you're drilling and to move things out of the way and to protect things. You won't necessarily need it, but I used an ohm meter to figure out which wires went to which switch on the Tron on the Tron stick. I used a 1-inch Forstner bit for the LED buttons across the top because those had a smaller diameter. I probably could have used even a smaller one, like a 7/8, for its snugger fit. And then the 1/8 bit for the larger buttons and for the spinner. And then, of course, a cordless drill and number 10 wrench and nut driver to move everything around. So that was kind of my bill of materials for doing this. And really, that's about it. I hope this was helpful. I built this because I couldn't find anything like this. I was more worried than I needed to be about cracking open the tank stick, and so there's plenty of videos of how to add a Tron stick to Arcade 1 or the 1-Up Arcade, I'm sorry, cabinet, but I couldn't find one on how to add a Tron stick that went into any detail to the tank stick. I saw videos out there about changing the buttons of the tank stick, but I didn't see any videos about moving buttons around and adding lighted buttons. So I thought, well, let me throw all this together. It's not as flashy as I usually have, but like I said, I don't think people wanted to watch me take out 8 screws and put 8 screws back in and strip wires and crimp wires and whatever. So it's more of a general guide to get you pointed in the right direction. So that's it. I think for my upgrade for a while, I still got to figure out how the push-pull mechanism is supposed to work. For now, I just try not to bump that button, but like I said, if it bumps that button, it screws everything up, and I pretty much have to reboot the machine to start working. So if you're not sure if you're ever going to use the push-pull, either get a different spinner or just don't connect those push-pull buttons like I did. Hope this is helpful. Sorry it's so long. We did 7 upgrades here. So it is what it is. But I'm, again, really happy with the final way this came out, and I hope this is helpful to you. Good luck with your activities as well.